The British monarchy has survived plagues, wars, abdications, and scandals that would have shattered lesser institutions into dust. It has bent under the weight of public fury, absorbed the shock of personal betrayals, and still managed to rise each morning with its crown intact. But what happens when the threat does not come from outside the palace gates? What happens when the earthquake originates from within the very walls that were built to protect the throne? Because right now, behind the polished ceremonial surface of the world's most famous royal family, something profound and irreversible has taken place. A woman who spent decades clawing her way from public disgrace to the highest position a consort can hold has just been quietly, methodically, and completely removed from the inner circle of the future. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, no tearful farewell, just silence. The kind of silence that only the most powerful people in the world know how to weaponize. And the person who pulled that trigger was not the future king, it was his aunt, the most disciplined, duty-bound, and quietly ferocious member of the British royal family, Princess Anne. The woman they call the monarchy's backbone has just made a move that will echo through royal history for generations. And the story of how she did it, why she did it, and what it means for the future of the British crown is far more extraordinary than anything the palace press office will ever confirm. To understand what Princess Anne has just done, you have to understand who she fundamentally is. Because this was never a sudden impulse or a moment of personal spite. This was the inevitable conclusion of a philosophical war that has been building inside the walls of the palace for more than 4 decades. Princess Anne has never chased approval. Not from the press, not from the public, and certainly not from the modern world's insatiable appetite for royal relatability. While other members of the family hired image consultants and carefully curated their social media presence, Anne continued doing what she has always done. She showed up, she worked, she served, quietly, relentlessly, and without the need for an audience. She has completed more royal engagements than almost any other member of the family for decades running. She does not do it for the cameras. She does it because, in her world, the crown is not a privilege. It is an obligation. This is the lens through which she has always viewed Queen Camilla. Not through the lens of personal hatred or old romantic rivalry, though the history there is complicated enough, but through the lens of principle, of what it truly means to earn a place beside the throne. Camilla's journey to becoming queen consort was, by any measure, remarkable. She endured years of public condemnation, navigated the grief of a nation that blamed her for the fracture of a fairy tale marriage, and gradually, through patience and strategic image rehabilitation, transformed herself into a figure of quiet acceptance. By the time King Charles placed the crown on her head, a significant portion of the British public had made their peace with her presence. But Princess Anne never fully did, not because she is a cruel woman, quite the opposite, but because to Anne the path Camilla walked to the crown was fundamentally different from the path that the crown demands. It was a path paved by public sympathy, media management, and the careful softening of a controversial history. And in Anne's unyielding framework, and the monarchy does not bend itself to accommodate personal narratives, people bend themselves to accommodate the monarchy. Those who have spent time within the inner circle describe a dynamic that was never openly hostile, but was always unmistakably cold. Anne offered Camilla precisely what protocol required, and nothing more. No warm embraces at family gatherings, no shared confidences over long dinners. Just the exact measure of cordiality that the institution demanded, and not a single degree beyond it. Insiders recall Anne reportedly saying to a trusted confidant at a private Balmoral event that some people wear the crown for duty, while others wear it merely for appearance. No names were mentioned, none needed to be. The tension sharpened considerably as Camilla began to settle more assertively into her role as queen consort. She became more vocal during ceremonial planning discussions, and she began positioning herself more prominently in the architecture of royal occasions. To the outside world, it looked like a woman finally coming into her own after a lifetime of waiting. To Princess Anne, it looked like a consort rewriting the boundaries of her own position in real time. And that, in Anne's world, is not personal ambition, it is institutional danger. There is a room inside Clarence House where the weight of history seems to press down on everything within it. The paintings watch you, the silence has a texture. It is a place where nothing casual has ever been said, because nothing casual has ever needed to be. It was in this room, on a late afternoon, that those close to the situation describe as unnervingly still, that Prince William sat down across from Queen Camilla and ended the polite fiction that had governed their relationship for years. William did not arrive as a grieving stepson navigating the tenderness of a family in transition. He arrived as the Prince of Wales, the future king, and a man who had spent months watching something that disturbed him deeply and had finally decided that watching was no longer an option. What he had observed was a gradual but unmistakable shift in Camilla's presence within the palace machinery. He saw it in the way she inserted herself into ceremonial planning conversations. He saw it in the way she positioned herself in official photographs, always slightly closer to the center than protocol traditionally allowed for a consort. He saw it in the quiet but persistent way her office was beginning to shape the narrative of occasions that, in his mind, belonged to the next chapter. His chapter. The chapter that had not yet been written, and that he was determined to write himself. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the warmth that royal observers typically associate with the carefully managed public face of the Wales household. He was measured, he was precise, and he was final. And he told Camilla directly that the planning for his future coronation was now moving into a serious phase, and that it needed to reflect a singular, undiluted vision. A vision that belonged to him and to Catherine alone. He was not asking her to step aside out of cruelty. He was informing her of a structural reality. The bridge between the present reign and the future one had to be clean, clear, and unambiguous. Her ongoing presence in the highest level strategy meetings was beginning to blur that line in ways that he could no longer allow. What happened next is the moment that changed everything. Camilla did not respond with hurt feelings or defensive anger. She responded with something far more dangerous: dismissal. With a tone that blended soft amusement and a condescension she likely did not intend to be quite so sharp, she leaned forward slightly and said, with a small smile, that it was all symbolic tradition. Nothing more. Yet for a woman who had survived everything the British public had thrown at her over 3 decades, it was perhaps an attempt to diffuse the tension by minimizing the stakes. But for William, those words were not a de-escalation, they were a detonation. Because to him, symbolic tradition is not nothing. It is everything. It is the entire reason the institution exists. It is what his grandmother gave her entire life to protect. It is what his mother died in the shadow of. And it was now being waved away with a smile and the word darling. He stood. The room shifted, and in a voice that was quiet but carried the full weight of everything he had inherited and everything he was determined to protect, he said words that have since become the defining statement of this internal reckoning. This is not your crown to shape. He did not wait for a response. He walked out. And the silence he left behind was the loudest thing the walls of Clarence House had heard in years. The very next morning, and William went to the one person he knew would understand exactly what had just happened. Not an advisor, not a communications director, not a sympathetic cousin. He went to Princess Anne. When he recounted the meeting, the dismissal, and the word that had been the final straw, Anne did not flinch. She did not express surprise. If anything, those close to both of them say she looked like a woman who had been waiting for this conversation for a very long time. What followed between them was not a heated strategy session or a dramatic declaration of war. It was something far more powerful. It was an agreement between two people who share the same iron understanding of what the monarchy requires. Quiet, precise, and absolutely final. Within days, the machinery of the palace began to move in ways that the outside world could not see, but that the inner circle felt immediately. The communication channels that had previously included Camilla's office in every significant planning thread were quietly restructured. New layers of internal correspondence were established that bypassed her senior staff entirely. Meeting agendas were revised. Physical gatherings were relocated to private rooms within Kensington Palace, rather than the shared spaces where Camilla's team would expect an invitation. When her office reached out for updates, they received polite responses citing administrative reviews and scheduling adjustments. The responses were professional, they were courteous, and they said absolutely nothing. Anne's contribution to this process was the element that made it impenetrable. She understood the architecture of palace bureaucracy better than anyone alive. She knew exactly which documents required a consort's involvement and which ones could be legitimately rerouted through other channels. She knew where the walls were, where the doors were, and precisely which keys opened which locks. And she used every piece of that knowledge to ensure that when Camilla eventually looked up from the world she thought she controlled, she would find herself standing entirely outside of it. Within the span of just a few weeks, Queen Camilla had been systematically removed from every meaningful planning conversation surrounding the future of the monarchy. She still held her title, she still wore her jewels. She still appeared at public engagements with the practiced grace of a woman who knew how to perform for an audience. But in the rooms where the actual future was being written, her seat had been taken away, and the door had been locked from the inside. When the full extent of what had happened finally became clear to her, the response from within Clarence House was, by all accounts, a fury unlike anything the staff had witnessed. But by then, there was nothing left to fight. The realignment had already been completed. The new structure was already operational. The future had already moved on without her. And there is a moment in every major historical shift when someone decides that words must be written down. When the gravity of what is happening demands a document, a record, a declaration that cannot be misremembered or conveniently reinterpreted later. Princess Anne wrote hers by hand, not digitally, not through a private secretary, by hand, alone, at her desk at Gatcombe Park, in the quiet hours of a cold Tuesday morning. And the fact that she chose pen and paper rather than the secure digital channels available to her tells you everything about the weight she placed on what she was about to say. The letter was addressed to King Charles, and its contents, which eventually reached him through the most discreet of channels, represent the clearest and most devastating articulation of what this internal crisis is truly about. She began by acknowledging the burden they had both inherited from their mother. Not the glamour of the crown or the privileges of the palace, but the relentless, unforgiving weight of a duty that asks you to sacrifice your private self entirely for the sake of an ancient idea. She wrote about the crown not as an ornament of power, but as a living obligation that demands everything and returns nothing except the satisfaction of having served something greater than yourself. And then she turned to the present. She described what she saw happening within the palace as a slow, almost imperceptible transformation of the monarchy into what she called a pageant of contradiction. She wrote about the danger of an institution that begins to prioritize its appearance over its purpose, about the corrosive effect of allowing public sympathy and media management to dictate the shape of ceremonial duties that should be governed only by tradition and rank. She never once mentioned Camilla by name. She did not need to. The architecture of her argument pointed in one direction and one direction only. She was describing a woman whose rise had been built on image rehabilitation rather than institutional service, and whose expanding influence within the palace represented, in Anne's view, a fundamental threat to the integrity of the throne. The most powerful section of the letter focused on William. She described him as the last strong pillar of the family, a man who carried within him both the gravity of history and the clarity of purpose that the next generation desperately needed. Her belief in him was absolute and unconditional, but she attached a warning to that belief that was as cold as it was loving. She told Charles that if the path toward William's reign was allowed to become cluttered with the competing ambitions and overreaching influences of the present, that pillar would eventually crack under the accumulated weight. And if it cracked, there would be nothing left to hold the institution upright. She asked her brother to let go, not of his wife, not of his love, but of his instinct to protect her at the expense of the future. She reminded him that their mother had carried the loneliness of the crown with a grace that sometimes required pushing away the people she loved most, not out of coldness, but out of an understanding that the crown belongs to history, not to any individual who happens to wear it. This letter was the foundation upon which everything that followed was built. It gave William the moral authority to act. It gave Anne the shared understanding she needed to move with precision. And it placed King Charles in the most painful position of his reign, and forced to choose between the woman he loves and the son he is preparing to hand the world to. When Charles finally confronted his sister in a private meeting at Windsor, he did not come as a monarch, he came as a husband. His voice, those present describe, carried a tremor of emotion that all the years of royal training had failed to completely contain. He spoke about loyalty, about the decades of judgment Camilla had endured to stand beside him, about the patient, painful work of rebuilding her public image from the wreckage of scandal into something the nation could accept. He was not making an institutional argument. He was making a human one. "She is my wife," he said. 3 words that carried 40 years of complicated, embattled, finely realized love. Anne listened without interrupting. She stood rather than sat, which those familiar with her body language understand as a signal that she had not come to negotiate. But when she responded, she did not argue against Camilla's character or dismiss the journey she had made. She simply spoke the language that Charles, in his emotional distress, had momentarily forgotten how to speak. She reminded him that the monarchy does not belong to the individuals who wear the crown. It belongs to the history that came before them, and the future that must outlast them. She told him plainly that her loyalty had never been to his personal happiness. It was to the institution that their mother spent her entire life building and protecting. "He is our future," she said, and in those 4 words she made clear that the conversation was over before it had truly begun. Because Charles could not argue against William's future without arguing against everything the monarchy stands for. Oh, he could not defend Camilla's presence in the coronation planning without conceding that personal relationships should outweigh institutional integrity. And he could not ask Anne to stand down without asking her to become something she had never been and would never be. The king sat in silence as his sister gave a single brief nod, the professional courtesy of protocol rather than the warmth of family, and walked away. He had lost, not because he argued badly, but because he was fighting for a person while she was fighting for a 1,000-year-old idea. And in the palace, when those 2 things are placed on opposite sides of the scale, the idea wins every time. While the old guard processed the fallout of what had just transpired, a quieter and far more significant shift was taking shape elsewhere. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, did not announce her assent. She did not position herself as a replacement or declare the beginning of a new era. She simply stepped into the space that the moment had created and filled it with an authority that felt, to everyone around her, entirely natural. And in the early coronation planning meetings, Catherine was not a symbolic presence. She was a working force. She brought ideas that were grounded in deep respect for tradition while being fearlessly focused on the future. She understood that a coronation in the 21st century could not simply be a repetition of centuries-old ritual. It had to speak to a generation that approaches the monarchy with open skepticism and demands authenticity in return for its loyalty. The contrast between her presence and Camilla's recent trajectory was stark and unspoken, but impossible to miss. Where Camilla's involvement had begun to feel like an assertion of influence, Catherine's felt like an extension of purpose. She was not trying to carve out a legacy. She was trying to build something lasting and real. So the partnership between William and Catherine in these meetings was described by those present as something genuinely rare within the history of the firm. 2 people operating not through hierarchy or command, but through a shared vision that neither needed to explain to the other because they had spent years building it together, quietly, deliberately, and without the need for external validation. The message being sent to the wider royal household through all of this was not subtle. The era in which a consort's personal journey and public image could shape the architecture of the monarchy's future was over. The authority now resided with the heir and his partner, guided by the uncompromising structural wisdom of the Princess Royal. And the foundation they were building together was not going to accommodate ambiguity, compromise, or the competing narratives of those whose path to the crown had been unconventional. The dust will eventually settle. It always does, inside the ancient stones of Windsor and the polished corridors of the palaces that line the banks of the Thames. The institution has survived worse than this, and it will likely survive whatever comes next. But something has irrevocably shifted. What we have witnessed is not a family argument that got out of hand, or a temporary realignment of social dynamics within a complicated household. It is a deliberate, coordinated, and permanent redefinition of where the boundaries of influence lie in the British monarchy as it prepares for its next chapter. Princess Anne has spent 7 decades being the person in the room who says the thing that no one else is willing to say. The person who draws the line when everyone else is still debating whether a line is necessary. She has never done it for recognition. She has never done it to win. She has done it because in her world, the survival of the institution is not a preference. It is a non-negotiable obligation. Whether you believe her intervention was a courageous act of institutional preservation or a cold-blooded erasure of a woman who had finally earned her place, one thing is beyond dispute. The move was decisive. The move was final. And the move was made by someone who understood, better than anyone, exactly what she was doing and exactly what it would cost. The seat once reserved for Camilla at the table where the future is being planned now sits empty. William and Catherine have moved forward. The blueprint of the next reign is being drawn without her signature on it. And somewhere within the ancient walls of the palace, the machinery of the monarchy continues to turn. Silent, disciplined, and utterly indifferent to the personal cost of its own survival. And because that is what the crown has always demanded, and that is what it will always demand. The only question that remains is whether the price being paid right now is the price of saving the monarchy, or the price of losing its humanity in the process.